Welcome to the Catholic Kiwi Podcast. In these episodes, we're going to be exploring interesting stories about faith, mission, and ministry from interesting Catholics, both those who live here and those who are visitors to these shores. We hope you'll find some inspiration and encouragement from these stories as you go about living your everyday faith as a Catholic in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thanks for tuning in. My guest for this episode is the man dubbed the Pope's astronomer. More formally, he's the director of the Vatican Observatory, a role he's held for a decade after being appointed by Pope Francis. Brother Guy Consolmagno is a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and he's made time during his fourth visit down here to New Zealand to talk with us here on the Catholic Kiwi Podcast. Brother Guy, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's fantastic to have you here, and I've got so many questions that I want to get into. We could talk about, Galileo and the Big Bang Theory, but we'll get to those later. I want to get to those. I'm really keen to, as we normally start our episodes, to learn a little bit more about you as a person. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about growing up, your family life, your faith life, your education?
Well, I was a Sputnik kid. I started kindergarten when Sputnik was launched in 1957, which meant I was finishing high school when people landed on the moon, which is amazing when you think about what a compression of technology and advances that was. At first, I was going to be a scientist. All little boys in America in the 60s were going to be scientists. And I certainly enjoyed the science and the engineering. My dad had been a navigator in B-17s during the war and had learned navigation from that and learned the stars from that. But he was interested in astronomy even growing up as a kid. He was the son of an Italian immigrant, but Grandpa was 7 years old when he came over, so he was really educated in America. And in fact, my grandfather, 7-year-old knowing no English, wound up going to a magnet school in Boston English, and then Boston University, and was a lawyer. So I was by no means first in my family to go to college that way. My mom was Irish, came from upstate New York, and she was a school teacher. They had met before the war and married even before the war was over. Dad was liberated and came back to America. And in May of 45, they were married in June of 45. So I was the youngest of three. And so an Italian-Irish background, very Catholic, as you can imagine. Dad was very successful in business. He wound up going from journalism into public relations, and helped found the public relations department at Chrysler Corporation, which in those days was a very successful company. So I grew up in affluent background outside of Michigan, in Detroit, Michigan. What I mostly grew up with was, though, a really supportive, loving household, in the sense that it was, expected without any pressure that I could do anything I wanted. My siblings and I have stayed close over all these years, even though we're very different. My sister was a school teacher, married, had a family. She's got grandkids now. My brother was a hippie and bounced around various universities, eventually wound up doing music, first as, an avocation. He had a teaching. My brother had a job in northern Michigan, in Marquette, Michigan, printing T-shirts, and everybody in the shop printing T-shirts had a master's degree, including him. They just, wanted something to keep the body and soul together while they did the artsy things that they loved to do. For him, it was music, blues music in particular.
Excellent.
And I was the nerd who, first I was going to be, I was going to be a journalist, I was going to be a lawyer, I was going to be a science fiction writer. I started out, after doing classics in high school at the Jesuit high school, I started out at Boston College thinking history. It was a bad fit for me. My best friend, Mike Timrick, was off at MIT. I'd visit him to go to the science fiction library and fell in love with MIT. So I transferred. I totally, on a whim, not knowing what I was doing, chose Earth and planetary science to be my major there, because I was transferring just to see if they'd let me in. And they did. And I arrived to discover, to my horror, that I had signed up for the geology department. I mean, what could be more boring than looking at rocks? This was not what I thought. But I was really there to read science fiction. And then I discovered a particular kind of rock called meteorites.
Yes.
These are rocks from the asteroid belt that fly through the atmosphere, land on the ground. You can hold in your hand a rock that's 4.5 billion years old and came from outer space. I was captivated. The professor I had who taught me this stuff was captivating, John Lewis. I fell in love with it so much that I did really well. They invited me to stay for a master's degree, and then I did my doctorate in planetary science at Arizona. Brand new department, fourth person in the world to get a department. Fourth person in the world to get a degree in planetary sciences.
And so it's fascinating. Was astronomy an interest from early on, or was it just when you got to MIT after you were out of the library?
Well, certainly from the beginning. So our family had a wonderful little house, a little summer cottage, in amongst summer cottages of all sorts of people, blue collar, white collar. And I got to see the stars on the shores of Lake Huron. That made a big difference to me. You could see the northern lights. That made a big difference. My dad would point out the stars. That was amazing. I had a book called The Stars, written by the guy who wrote the Curious George books.
Oh, right.
I still have that book.
Right.
I still use it to remind myself where things are in the sky. And so I had that tremendous love of looking at the sky. But the thought of being a professional astronomer only occurred to me when I was visiting MIT, and I thought, I have no idea what a professional astronomer does. I'll become one and find out.
I love that. And so when you finished your study, you then entered the Peace Corps.
Well, I'd come back after my doctorate to Boston. I loved Boston. I loved the intellectual atmosphere. I thought, this is where I'm going to put down my roots. I was 5 years as a postdoctoral researcher, first at Harvard, then at MIT. And if you know academia, 5 years as a postdoc means couldn't get a job. There was a moment, we were talking about, before we went on camera, we were talking about our backgrounds in high tech. This was 1982.
Right.
High tech, especially in the Boston, Cambridge area, was booming. A guy in my dorm had invented this thing called the spreadsheet program.
Yes, indeed.
So I got a job offer to work for the company that had come up with VisiCalc. And as I'm walking home from the job offer, doubling what I was making as a research scientist, and I realized at that point I had actually met a nice woman who was normal. We hadn't dated or anything. Should I ask her out? Should I take this job? And I had this picture of myself living in the suburbs with a dog and a cat and 2.4 children in a Volvo station wagon.
White picket fence.
White picket fence, the whole bit. And I screamed, no, I can't do this. Instead, I asked, what is it that I wanted to do? I wanted to do something important for the world. I wanted to change, what's the point of astronomy when people are starving? So I joined the Peace Corps as a kind of rebellion, both to the pointless science that seemed to be going nowhere, or the job just to have a big salary. And the first thing they did was to send me to Kenya. And the second thing was to send me to the university to teach, astrophysics, which is what I thought was pointless. But everybody in my group in the Peace Corps, there were 80 of us going to 80 different schools around Kenya. I'd go visit them on the weekends with a little telescope. Of course, I had a little telescope. I'm a nerd. And everybody in the village wanted to look through the telescope. Everybody in the village wanted to hear stories of what NASA was discovering on the moon. And it didn't matter if you were living in Boston or living in Kisumu. This is something that was exciting to you because you're a human being. Anyone who's ever looked at Saturn through a little telescope is going to go, oh, wow. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Melbourne or if you're in Nairobi. And I suddenly realized this is what makes us human beings. This is what makes us more than just well-fed cows. You feed your soul. Mm-hmm. And I love doing that. Mm-hmm. And I love the teaching that they had me do at the university. So when I went back to the United States, I was able to get a teaching job. And I thought, this is it. This is really where my calling is, to teach. I remembered the Jesuits who had taught me. And at first I thought, I don't have a vocation to be a priest. I'd explored that earlier, and I knew I didn't have the talents. I didn't have the people skills. I couldn't listen to people with problems and relate because I'd had much too happy a childhood. My brother, who's a blues musician, always says that's why he was a never great blues player. He just, loves the music, but he had much too happy a childhood. Blame our parents for that. I realized that Jesuits have brothers, and that just rang right. And when I prayed about it, it just rang right. And every time I prayed, I'd feel this call, which I couldn't even understand at times, but I knew that's what God meant me to be. I talked to women I dated, and they said, "Oh yeah, definitely. You're much better off being a Jesuit brother." People I'd known since high school. My Italian father, who was the kind of guy who would go to church and scowl without really participating, he said to me, "Guy, I could have told you that when you were in high school." And they were right. As soon as I joined the Jesuits and found myself at the novitiate, I knew this is where I belonged.
Amazing. So back then, how much had you grappled with the questions that are at the intersection of faith and science?
They want me, as a director of the Vatican Observatory, to address these questions. And it's really hard, because I don't get the question. What questions? I've never had any kind of conflict. Who taught me science? The nuns in my grade school. They never saw a conflict. The Jesuits in my high school were the ones who taught the chemistry classes. They never saw a conflict. The hardest thing for me is to figure out, where are people coming from if they think there's a conflict? What's more natural if you love the Creator than to study creation? And if you're going to be a scientist, what I'd learned, with the thing that drove me to the Peace Corps, is you'd better have a better reason for being a scientist than just to get a bigger grant, just to get a better job, because that gets real old real fast. So to be able to say I'm doing science because I love the Creator and I encounter the Creator in creation, then it makes sense. Yeah. And then it makes sense why I get a burst of joy when I understand something that I didn't understand 2 minutes ago. Because that's the presence of God. That's God saying, yeah, let me show you the next one too.
So did your academic colleagues, did they think it was interesting that this man of science was entering into a religious order?
Weird thing happened. I'm 6 months into the novitiate. I'm visiting some of my scientist friends. And I'm afraid, what are they going to think? And they start asking me the big questions of life. I mean, I've only been a Jesuit 6 months, they haven't revealed that yet. But the other thing that starts happening is they go, "You go to church? So do I. Let me tell you about the church I go to." And people who I had known for years, people who I never would have expected were religious, actually turned out to be deep people of faith. And because I had figuratively put on the collar, they were free to talk about it. And we discovered all sorts of wonderful things about each other's backgrounds.
I love that was something that actually opened up an opportunity for conversation with those things. Because sometimes, as you say, things are felt in opposition, but not in our faith. It's not a matter of science and faith should be at odds.
No. I'll tell you, the only times that it came up, one was very funny. I was doing my philosophy studies in Chicago, and there was this meteorite scientist who I knew pretty well at the University of Chicago. Tough as nails, would rip you to shreds if you got anything the slightest bit wrong. Really, hold yourself to the fire. And I'm at the University of Chicago taking an extension course, and I decide to visit him in his office. And he's very welcoming. And then he says, "So what you're in Chicago for?" "Well, I've become a Jesuit." And I could feel the temperature in the room drop. I thought, well, okay, I guess this was bound to happen sooner or later. Somebody was mad at me for being a Jesuit. So I'm making my polite, exits. And just before I leave, he goes, "Were you always Catholic?" I go, "Well, yeah, an Italian dad, an Irish mom, comes to the territory." And suddenly he's really friendly again. And before I know it, he's inviting me to come to his synagogue to give a talk. What had happened was not that he was anti-religion, but he thought I was Jewish. I had curly hair and a red beard. And when he realized I wasn't leaving Judaism, then that was great.
I love that.
Because he was, in fact, very religious himself. I had no idea. The two people who really, reacted badly to me coming out as being religious, if that's the phrase, both were British men.
Really?
And there's something about the weirdness of, I don't know, maybe it's the state religion in the United Kingdom, or really bad confirmation classes. I'm not sure what it is. But that's really the only place that I encountered that. And the last time I was in Britain, the Institute for Astronomy at Cambridge, I didn't see that at all anymore. From the younger people. It was a curiosity, it was an interest, it was, oh, how do you make that work?
You said that, and I think in an interview before your trip to New Zealand, this trip to New Zealand, that you're seeing more scientists having an interest or asking questions of faith. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think part of it is the recognition of the strengths, the benefit, and the joy of having diversity. That you really do better astronomy when everybody's not coming from the same little corner of astronomy. Certainly when you have people on a team, that's why papers in astronomy are co-authored with a dozen authors, not just a single author anymore, because you've got the strength of different points of view. And that includes the questions of why am I doing this? What am I hoping to get out of it? Because especially a young astronomer who's struggling with trying to find the grants and trying to find the job, at the same time maybe they're starting families or whatever, they worry about these things. They themselves are coming from a broader background. So, my friends in Britain are Hindus and Muslims as well as Church of England. So I think that's part of it. But I think part of it is simply that recognition of, oh, it's cool. I've got a friend who's Jewish, and I've got a friend who's Roman Catholic. I think that has opened the doors, with the downside that it also might tend to trivialize. That, your choice of what your religion is like your choice of what's your favorite coffee. When I would hope it would be a little more important than that.
I would hope so. I'm not a big coffee drinker myself, so I would hope so. You're talking about opening up those conversations, and Pope Leo has a background in science and mathematics in particular.
Actually, so did Francis, who had a background in chemistry.
Indeed. And Pope Leo spoke to, I think, Buzz Aldrin recently to sort of celebrate the anniversary of the moon landing. And Pope Francis, as you say, was also a Jesuit as well.
Yes, right.
What does having a pope with a scientific background mean to you and to the church?
It can be good and it can be bad. The good is that they understand what we're about. I've worked now for 4 popes. They've all had academic backgrounds to what they've been doing, so they understand why it's worth having an observatory, even though it's not bringing in money or rounding up millions of people to the church. That's not the point of it. They understand the nature of the intellectual side of the human being and why that needs to be fed, because we don't live by bread alone. The downside can happen when a pope or a cardinal thinks they know. This dangerously and wonderfully happened with Pope Pius XII.
Okay.
Now, back around 1910, the observatory had been around 20 years. There was a telescope on the wall of the Vatican being used by a priest named Giuseppe Leiss. And he worked great with kids, so he had like a gang of local teenagers who he'd come in to show the telescope once a month. Among the local teenagers was this rich kid named Eugenio Pacelli, who later on became Pius XII.
Okay.
Which is, one reason you want to be nice to teenagers. You never know who's going to
be the Pope. That's right.
Well, Pius XII loved astronomy, and he was fascinated by it. At one point, 1951, he gives a talk to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, another outfit that's really interesting, by the way. As the director of the observatory, I'm ex officio a member of the Pontifical Academy, which is great fun. Bunch of Nobel Prize winners, and
wow.
You don't even have to be Catholic. You don't have to be a believer. Stephen Hawking was a member of the Pontifical Academy.
Was he?
But anyway, he's talking to the Pontifical Academy, and he makes the observation that scientists nowadays say the Earth may be 5 billion years old and the universe may be 10 billion years old, and there may have started in a Big Bang, which the universe having a beginning was a radical idea in 1951. And he goes, yeah, of course, we could have told them that. He says it in a little more nuanced way, but really that's the message. The guy who invented the Big Bang Theory, though it wasn't called that by him, was a priest, George Lemaitre. And Lemaitre reads this and he goes, oh no, You do not want to conflate the Big Bang with creation. The Big Bang is what we think today might have happened after creation, but ask us in 500 years if we still believe that, because science grows. Meanwhile, the fact of creation by a God outside of space and time, creating space and time, is true regardless of how good or bad the science in Genesis 1 is. It's the theology of Genesis 1. It's not what it says about creation, it's what it says about the Creator. That's important. He goes to talk to Pius XII. And the Pope basically goes, "You're right." The Pope never says that again. He addresses the other astronomical groups. He did an audience to the meeting of the International Astronomical Union in 1952, where he has great praise for Galileo and Newton and Kepler, and doesn't try to make this connection between the Big Bang and Genesis. He got it. But he didn't check with somebody before writing his earlier speech.
I was thinking that maybe you're worried that they're going to be starting to peer review some of the papers and become the 11th co-author of the...
That's never happened, and thank heavens.
Yet. All right, I did warn you that we're going to get into some of the hot button controversial topics, if you're okay for that. You ready to go?
Bring them on.
Okay, what's the real story about Galileo and the church?
Everything you know about Galileo is probably wrong, but the truth does not make the church look any better.
Okay.
The Galileo myth was invented at the end of the 19th century as a way of making the church look stupid. The church is perfectly good at making itself look stupid. And I mean, if you wanted to dump on the church, you've got far better reasons than Galileo. But they would tell the story as if Galileo had come up with some incontrovertible proof of the truth of the Copernican system, and the church was afraid of it for religious reasons. None of that's true. Galileo didn't come up with the Copernican theory, Copernicus did. And Copernicus did 70 years before Galileo. And just before the Council of Trent, which was finding heresies everywhere, and found no heresy in Copernicus. That's interesting. Galileo writes this book in 1609 and basically skates free until 1632. So, okay, what's that all about? When you read the astronomical writings of Galileo's opponents, they are not filled with religion. They're filled with really good, but wrong, scientific reasons against Galileo. They couldn't understand, given what they knew of the universe at the time, how you could have a moving Earth and not see parallax motions in the stars, or other things that you should be able to see and they couldn't. And the answer is, it's not that they weren't there, it's just they couldn't, because they weren't, they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the techniques. Galileo's arguments in favor of the Copernican system are wrong. You read the arguments, and he has, an argument for, the spinning of the Earth is why there's one tide a day, except there isn't one tide a day. There are two tides a day. And the spinning of the Earth doesn't explain that. He has other arguments, scientific arguments that are fallacious. Now, he's right. The Earth is spinning. The Earth is going around the sun. But his arguments are not conclusive arguments. And finally, you can read the trial of Galileo, the trial of 1632-33, and it's not what you're expecting, a big debate between faith and science. Rather, it's Galileo saying, what did I say wrong? Let me fix it. Tell me what to fix, and I'll fix it. And the committee of 10 going, no, we have to find you guilty of something. At which point you're going, okay, what's going on here? Because up to then, he'd always been happy to, just sign off. The book that he was on trial for had been approved. The church had actually already approved the book.
Really?
So you've got to go, and the answer is, we don't know. Because they're very clever about not putting in writing what any of the motivations were. There's two live theories today. Theory number one, the more commonly held one, was that the Pope, who was Galileo's friend and had talked about these ideas at great length, was insulted at the way his ideas were presented in the book.
The Pope's ideas?
The Pope's ideas.
Okay.
And that's conceivable because they were presented in not a very sophisticated way. The other is that the Pope at the time, Urban VIII, was caught up in the politics of the 30 Years' War, which was at its crisis point at the same time as the Galileo trial. Mere coincidence? Well, actually, maybe, but maybe not. And Galileo was in a crucial political position with the Medici family, who had a lot of money that wasn't going one way or the other, and the Pope was being accused of being a secret Protestant by the Spanish for not supporting their side, and maybe it was caught up in the politics of the day. Maybe. But whatever it was not a faith versus science.
Right,
kind of thing.
okay. As you say, we didn't need any help to not look great, but
Yeah.
it wasn't because of the
It wasn't a
faith in
science deal, right.
Okay, so you talked a little bit before about the priest who proposed the theory of the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
People say the Big Bang theory is a kind of a rejection of a creator God. What say you?
If they say that, they don't understand what a creator God is.
Okay.
And I say this about a lot of people who claim to be atheists. You know, if you're rejecting a God for crazy reasons, well, the God you're rejecting may be a God I reject too, because that's not the God I believe in. The creation, let's just take the creation story from Genesis,
Okay.
Genesis 1. Now, the science is the best science of its day, 600 BC in Babylon, because that chapter was written by Jewish scholars during the Babylonian captivity. And you can tell because there's Babylonian words in the Hebrew. And it's the science of Babylon. It was obsolete within a couple of hundred years by Aristotle, who was a big advance on this. But Genesis is not just a retelling of the Babylonian creation myth. It is in many ways a rejection of the Babylonian myth, not in terms of how they thought the universe worked, because it was the best science of the day, but why the universe worked that way. The Babylonian story was a bunch of gods having a war, and creation gets made by accident. The Genesis story is God already there at the beginning, creating space and time, without nature gods, as logical as day follows night, deliberately, not by accident, saying at every stage, this is good. And where the goal of the Babylonian story was the city of Babylon, the best thing that they ever could imagine, the goal of the Genesis creation story is the Sabbath. It is human beings who are able to not just worry about how am I going to feed myself, but will take one day a week to contemplate the universe just for its own sake, as a way of praising the Creator. Genesis is not a story about creation, it's a story about the Creator. And what it has to say about the Creator in chapter 1 is equally valid in chapter 2, even though the creation story in chapter 2 is totally different. And is found, that's the same message of a God who loves creation, is found several different places in Scripture, including the book of Maccabees, one of the last books, where, almost as an aside, an unnamed mother supporting her child who's about to be killed for not eating the meat dedicated to pagan gods, says, don't worry, our God is the God who made the universe out of nothing. Which is very different from even, the Genesis story. But the point is, we are the religion, the people of the God who made the universe. And with that, we have the courage to do science.
I love that. I'd never thought about it through the perspective of it's about the Sabbath. It's about the taking time to contemplate the Creator, and it's not about the creation. Yeah, that's going to fester, that one. You've written a book titled Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? Mm-hmm. And what do we know, or do we think we know, about life on other planets and in other galaxies, and what that might mean for our faith?
What we know is almost nothing. Life does exist in the universe, at least in one place, here on Earth. And beyond that, it's all wild speculation. A guy who I actually got to know, Frank Drake, back 60 years ago, came up with an equation of all the different terms that you need to know to be able to tell what are the odds of life being in the universe. And over the years, we've been able to come up with good numbers for a number of those terms. But one or two of them are still, could be anything. I'm reminded of an old joke from an American cartoonist, Walt Kelly, who has a couple of his characters in Pogo talking. And one of them says, you know, there are people who think that there are creatures in the universe smarter than human beings. And there are other people who think that human beings are the smartest creatures in the universe. Either way, it's a sobering thought. We don't know. What we do know is that poetically, and maybe even more than poetically, Scripture talks about the stars praising their Creator, talks about angels in a relationship with God, isn't afraid to contemplate a universe where human beings are not the only creation, not the only people interested in God. And what we know from scholastic theology, the human soul is the nexus of intellect and free will. Intellect is being aware, being self-aware. Free will is having the ability to say, yes, I will love this God, or no, I'm going to ignore this God. Any entity that's got that, doesn't matter how many tentacles, doesn't matter if they're made out of silicon, they're the human soul. They're not aliens, they're our cousins.
I love that. And I love that you went to silicon-based life forms as well, because I was like, what if they're not carbon? What if it's silicon-based? That's good.
Hey, what if they're computers?
What if they are computers? Because, I mean, this is something where right now we are sort of staring into the abyss a little bit on artificial intelligence.
Which is, of course, not really intelligence,
no.
But it allows you to ask the fun question. I mean, the point of that book was to ask it, the title, as a question, not because we have the answer. Lord knows I have no answers for these things. But in asking the question, you suddenly realize, what is an alien? Is somebody with intellect and free will actually that alien? And for that matter, what's baptism? What is the role of baptism? Why do we have baptism? Are angels baptized? Actually, no. What does that mean?
More thoughts that are definitely going I'm going to ponder on. This has been fantastic. Brother Guy, we usually end these episodes with a bit of a lightning round, figuratively, not literally. And so we're keen to get to know our guests a little bit more as we finish. Are you ready for that?
Give it a try.
Who's your favourite saint?
St. Ignatius.
Of Loyola?
Of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. I would be lost if Jesuits didn't exist. There would be no place in the universe for me.
Amazing. What's a quirky Catholic habit that you secretly or not so secretly love?
Daily rosary.
Why?
It brings pattern to chaos. It gives me something to hold on to when I'm afraid. And it reminds me of my Jesuit formation. An elderly Jesuit talking about his first mission, which was to go off to South America and start a high school in a place where he barely spoke the language. And I remember him looking at us and saying, "Men, I was so terrified, I actually started praying the rosary."
That's one motivation.
It also connects me to my wonderful childhood.
Yeah.
In our household, we had daily rosaries in May and October.
Wonderful.
With the family.
Wonderful.
I can hear my father, the skeptic, but leading the rosary and praying the Our Father in his thick Boston accent.
I remember my father leading us. He'd walk up and down the hallway with us all in bed, in the family, and that being a part of what it was.
Yeah.
And what's a song or hymn that stirs your Catholic sentiments?
There's two. The Here I Am, Lord. That kept going through my head as I was discerning my vocation.
Mm-hmm.
And a Christmas carol, which they only sing the first verse because it's really the only good verse. Tomorrow will be my dancing day.
Oh. What a wonderful way to end our time together, Brother Guy. It's been a true honour and a pleasure just to spend time with you and to geek out and nerd out with you a little bit beforehand as well. Thank you so much for making the time to spend with us, and please do enjoy your time here on our shores in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Well, you can tell I've enjoyed this as well. So thanks a whole lot for having me.
Thank you.